The intent from the beginning was to focus on the reality of genocide as it is happening currently in the first decade of the 21st century, and as it can be traced back to the Mandate period, when the British authorities had control of a land area that was about to import thousands and ultimately millions of Jewish people. I had done research in the Rhodes House archives at Oxford University, looking for materials that somehow would explain what the intent of the Zionist group that Ilan Pappé calls the Red House group in The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, his book. What their intent was when they were bringing over and working with, apparently, at least on the surface, the British government in Palestine to facilitate the entrance of these people into the land area that Britain was in control of. And so I went to the Rhodes House Library with the intent of trying to focus on the months between the partition plan of November 1947 and the exit of the British Mandate government on May 15, 1948. The result of that research, approximately 500 pages of evidence that list information on 6 areas of illegitimate activity on the part of the Jewish resistance movement against the British forces. They intentionally say that they will make it a British problem in Mandate Palestine if they do not act to fulfill the Zionist solution. I can read you sections of the files here, which amount to, in one section, a threat, if you will, to the British forces. And let me read just a small section of this so that you have some idea of what we're talking about. We regard it, second page, number 5, as our duty to caution you against any attempt to decide on an anti-Zionist solution and make good for it by an increased grant of immigration certificates. The transfer of a certain number of refugees from Europe to Palestine will not solve the political question of the existence and independence of the Jewish people. We shall not accept the status of a minority in our land, whether the minority is 33% or 49%. We know what has happened to the Assyrians in Iraq, and we are aware of the lot of the Jewish minorities in the Arab states today. We shall not accept the symbolic independence in a dwarf-like token state which will not give us the chance of developing all the resources of the country and creating here a safe asylum for all Jews who are compelled or wish to come. A half-hearted compromise on the Palestinian question can only lead to disaster. It will not solve the Jewish problem. This final statement at the end. The Jews are a nation. The land of Israel belongs to the people of Israel. The Jewish state will be established. It is better that it should be established with your help and for your benefit than against you.
And the idea was that by blowing up these villages and eliminating their physical presence, refugees would be less likely to return since their homes were no longer there. And it would make the landscape, it would sort of de-Palestinianize the landscape. Basically, it would no longer look like there was a village there. So you're erasing the memory of Palestinian presence on the land.
Hazem Jamjoom is the editor of Al-Majdal, the English-language quarterly magazine of the Badil Resource Center for Palestinian Residency and Refugee Rights in Bethlehem, Palestine. Alternate Focus sat down with Hazem in his office in the West Bank, where he explained the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Well, the roots of what we call the Nakba, which is the Arabic word for catastrophe, also called the 1948 war, and for the Zionist movement is called the War of Independence, actually go back to Europe in the late 19th century. In the late 19th century, it was sort of, there emerged a new response to anti-Semitism, which was very much informed by European culture at the time, specifically the idea that if you're European, you have some kind of right to go to Africa, Asia, Latin America, and colonize, and that the indigenous communities in these areas could be treated the same as the trees and the rocks and the other mineral resources. They didn't really have rights, so to speak. Another aspect was this new idea of the nation, that the humanity is divided into these types of people. So there's Germans, there's British, and for each one of these nations, there's some kind of right to a political entity, a state. As a response to anti-Semitism, we can consider the Jewish people, and this is a unique case because it's a religious group before this idea comes out, that this religious group is a nation and deserves a state, and by having this state somewhere outside of Europe that we can colonize elsewhere, this would be the response to anti-Semitism. This state would protect the Jewish people from anti-Semitism, and it would be a place where Jewish people could come together and thrive. Also, interestingly, this idea of the Jewish state is invested with the different sort of utopic ideas and visions of different kinds of political trends within the Jewish community. So Jewish socialists in Europe thought of the state as the socialist workers' state, while fascists within the Jewish community saw this as, the ethnically pure Jewish state that was in line with their political thinking. So there's a very wide spectrum of, this movement becomes called Zionism, and a very wide spectrum of Zionist thought, what this state would look like.
And no matter what the Israelis do, You know, and they said already what their program is: genocide, transfer, or starvation. That's Mordechai, the commander of the West Bank.
There are some detachments in the Israeli army, I don't know whether it's a platoon or whatever the size is, that have called themselves the Mengele detachment.
Oh my God.
And the Auschwitz detachment. And what they have done is, in order to show that they're particularly tough in relation to putting down this Palestinian insurrection.
You look at the popular education, which, by the way, any student or any teacher who is caught engaged in the popular education could be sentenced to 5 years or 10 years in jail. Why? Because the Israelis have closed the schools since the beginning of the Intifada. We don't want our people to be ignorant. We want our children to learn. So people started engaging in a popular education manner. In homes, they would sit together, teach the children, you know, and the children will be going with books, knapsacks on their back, you know, and so on. And the Israelis started stopping the children, and they arrested a few teachers.
Two women who were born in Palestine, one Jewish, the other Palestinian, give us some information and some interpretations as to what has been happening in Israel and the occupied territories. Right. We have with us Barbara Harlow, who's with the Department of English at the University of Texas. Barbara and the Palestinian Solidarity Committee have just finished a whole week, a Palestine week, in which they've had a lot of speakers and documentaries which they've shown, and they've had a lot of discussion groups. And there are two people who have participated in this, are going to be with us now on Alternative Views. Edna Hunt is from Boston, but she was born in Israel. And she, of course, has an interest in the situation in Palestine. And Rabab Hadi is also living in New York, but she is Palestinian.
I was a very faithful Israeli until, I would say, and I had swallowed hook, line, and sinker the Zionist government lines until, I would say, the Yom Kippur War. And that began to open my eyes to the realities of what the aims of the Israeli government and people was.
And this was when?
And that was in 1973.
Okay.
I didn't become really super active until really the Lebanon War broke out in 1982. And it was then that I shifted into high gear, because it seemed to me that what happened on the Lebanon border and the invasion of Lebanon and all the rather nasty events that ensued from that invasion had to be counteracted, because it was a formidable pack of lies. And it was, to me, also because I came to know some of the people who were in Israel opposed to that invasion. But it became clear to me that I had to give much more time to counteract the official lines, both inside the Israel and also the Israeli connection with the United States, and a very, very strong pro-Israeli line in the United States. But the British mandate lasted from 1920, essentially, until 1948, when the British left. And during that time, I grew up, and I grew up in a multi-ethnic society. In other words, I interacted with Arabs, with Armenians, with Greeks, with Turks. These were my playmates in Jerusalem, where I grew up the first years of my life.
Well, I was born in Nablus,
Nablus.
the West Bank, which was at the time under Jordanian rule, which means I've never experienced any Palestinian identity on paper, on passport, or anything of the sort. When I was 12 years old, the Israeli occupation started in 1967, and I've seen, friends, neighbors, family members being arrested, taken away, some expelled. A cousin of mine spent 7 years in Israeli jails. He was tortured. And then the last day before he was released, he requested that he would be released. He agreed to stay in prison longer in order to be released in Ramallah, which is also on the West Bank. The day before he was released, the Israelis shipped him across the bridge to Jordan. They expelled him, basically.
And when was this?
That was in 1974 or something like that.
The word genocide now, getting back to the purpose of the book, was to find out if the original intent, which was promulgated here in 42, 44, 46, 45, and 46, in fact, is what was intended and what the British thought was supposed to be intended when they came to the authority vested in them by the League of Nations and later by the United Nations. This report by the High Commissioner, Harold McMichael, and it's listed as most secret, and it's written in 1941, sent to the Secretary of State. And in this piece, he speaks about the consequences of what he is faced with in a country where, in the mandate country that he's overseeing, where the control of the Majesty's government is being threatened. And he makes reference to the Balfour Declaration, but he makes reference to it in such a way that it is different in kind than what we ordinarily think of as the Balfour Declaration. Let me read to you this piece from the Avalon Project at Yale University, which describes the Balfour Declaration and its intent. Quote, unauthorized statements have been made to the effect that the purpose in view is to create a wholly Jewish Palestine. His Majesty's government regard any such expectation as impracticable and have no such aim in view, nor have they at any time contemplated the disappearance or the subordination of the Arabic population, language, or culture in Palestine. They would draw attention to the fact that the terms of the Balfour Declaration referred to do not contemplate that Palestine as a whole should be converted into a Jewish national home, but that such a home should be founded in Palestine. His Majesty's government therefore now declare unequivocally that it is not part of their policy that Palestine should become a Jewish state. Now this, it seems to me, is pretty clear, and it means that the the mandate government has authority for both people to bring the Jewish people in so that that homeland can be established, but at the same time to make sure that the indigenous population is cared for and their culture and bodies protected. This became an impossibility. What they ended up doing, obviously, was to hand that dilemma over to the UN. It produces in 1947, November, the partition plan. That gave 55% of the mandate area to the Jews and 45% to the Palestinians. Now, what then is genocide? And what authority do you go to find out what genocide is? The book goes to Raphael Lemkin's definition. His study was of what happened to the Jewish population in Nazi Germany. What he found was that it was the way in which the Nazis treated the Jews had implications across the board for any population that might try to impact another, either by occupation, oppression, or removal of people. And so he wrote up a definition and created a word, genocide. It became, in 1948, the UN articles on what genocide is. Now, if I read two things, let me read two things to you here. One is a description that is put together by Frank Chalk and Kurt Johannesson, summarizing what Lemkin's definition means. Under Lemkin's definition, genocide was the coordinated and planned annihilation of a national, religious, or racial group by a variety of actions aimed at undermining the foundations essential to the survival of the group as a group. Lemkin conceived of genocide as a composite of different acts of persecution or destruction. His definition included attacks on political and social institutions, culture, language, national feelings, religion, and the economic existence of the group. Even non-lethal acts that undermined the liberty, dignity, and personal security of members of a group constituted genocide if they contributed to weakening the viability of the group. Under Lemkin's definition, acts of ethnocide, a term coined by the French after the war to cover the destruction of a culture without the killing of its bearers, also qualified as genocide. Now that's the overall understanding synopsized. When it was brought into two articles in the United Nations to define genocide, it takes on for Article 2, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethical, racial, or religious group as such. A, killing members of the group. B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. E, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. And then Article 3, the following acts shall be punishable. A, genocide. B, conspiracy to direct and public incitement to commit genocide. D, attempt to commit genocide. And E, complicity in genocide. Now, what that understanding does is to put into context a way of evaluating and assessing the conditions that exist in a situation similar to what we have in Palestine.
The Palestinian community within Zionist thought is largely invisible. But as Jewish colonization begins and people begin to realize not only are there people in Palestine, but there's a thriving economy and a culture, and it's part of a wider civilization in the region, some thoughts begin to emerge as to how to create, for example, the workers' state of Jewish and non-Jewish Palestinian workers, or of one state for all of the people on the land. But the idea of the Jewish state remains the dominant idea. It wasn't always Palestine that was the main goal. Different trends within the Zionist movement had different ideas. It's notable that the religious Jewish establishment opposed Zionism overall because it was counter to the teachings or the scriptures. The idea of creating the Jewish state before the coming of the Messiah was considered a form of heresy by many rabbis. And Zionists got over this by saying that no, by creating the Jewish state we could accelerate the coming of the Messiah. So to make kind of a long story short, the decision to come to Palestine is made at a conference at the end of the century that's held in Basel in Switzerland. And institutions are set up to facilitate this goal. The main institution is one called the Zionist Organization. In the early 50s, it's renamed the World Zionist Organization. And this is the main umbrella of the Zionist movement and continues to be until today. The act of bringing Jewish people from outside of Palestine to Palestine, sort of that responsibility is given to something called the Jewish Colonization Agency. After World War I, the word colonization is no longer in vogue. So the name of the organization is changed to the Jewish Agency. And this becomes a kind of de facto government of the Jewish community in Palestine in the 20s, 30s, and early 40s. And the leadership of the Jewish Agency become the same people who become the prime minister and the ministers and the government and the leading officials of the Israeli state after it's established. The other main organization here is something called the Jewish National Fund. And it was given the responsibility, set up to acquire land in Palestine and neighboring areas for the purpose of settling Jewish people, and in a sense exclusively Jewish people. This organization also continues to exist today, although after 1948 it changed its public image because what it began to do was to plant trees in parks and forests, which are built on the land of Palestinian refugees. Most often you can actually see the destroyed villages as you walk through these parks and forests. And it set out in earnest. I mean, most of this required massive fundraising abroad, and this money was used both to bring Jewish people in through the working of the Jewish Agency and to try to acquire land. Palestinians began to wake up to this in the 1920s. What had happened is in World War I, the British had defeated the Ottoman Empire and its allies, and so Palestine came under British occupation, or what was euphemistically called the Mandate. So Palestine was sort of held in trust by the British. And what the British had done in 1917 was promised the Jewish people a homeland in the land of Palestine. This was the infamous Balfour Declaration of 1917. And it's notable that Balfour himself was a prominent anti-Semite. You know, he's on record in the British Parliament saying that we shouldn't have Jewish people in Britain. And this is sort of one of the early signs of the kind of common interests between the Zionist movement, which wanted Jewish people to leave Europe and go somewhere else, and many of the anti-Semitic currents in Europe, which wanted no Jewish people to be in Europe. Now, in the 20s and 30s, the British begin to really help the Zionist movement. How? By facilitating immigration, Jewish immigration into Palestine. In the 30s, when there's a Palestinian uprising, the British begin to arm and train Jewish police forces, what they call the settlement police. Certain Jewish military units are trained specifically on how to punish a village, which involve home demolitions and sort of gathering people into central spaces and different kinds of collective punishment, and a host of other laws that gave preferential treatment to Jewish community members in the fields of work, in the fields of different kinds of services, facilitating the transfer of land from Palestinians to the Jewish National Fund and other Zionist organizations. And most notably, and this is probably one of the most important things, is that with the coming to power of Nazism and fascism in Europe, and eventually the Holocaust, there's a large number of Jewish people who just don't want to be in Europe anymore, refugees of the Holocaust. And what countries like the United States, Canada, Britain, Australia do is they close off their borders to Jewish refugees. Again, this is very much a sign of anti-Semitism in what we call the West. And on the ground meant that a Jewish refugee from the Holocaust had very few options on where to go. And one of the only options was Palestine. So even if they were not ideologically Zionist, then one of their only options was to actually come to Palestine.
When we began, the map of Palestine was roughly 94% indigenous population. And it's quite clear that the Jews at this point, early on, began prior to the mandate with 6% of the land that they owned. With the immigration coming in, now you're looking at roughly 30%. So the population was obviously heavily indigenous, Arabic, and Palestinian. British Mandate Authority realized we can't absorb the numbers that are coming in and maintain a relationship of the indigenous population. The Jewish population had been concentrated in about two major cities, Tel Aviv and Haifa, and a smaller group in Jerusalem, and throughout the rest of Mandate Palestine, there was relatively a handful. What they ended up doing when they brought these people in was to set up a government working with the British called the Jewish Agency. Person responsible for job creation, dealing with economics, on behalf of the Jewish Agency, ostensibly as a cooperative government, so that people coming in would have home to live in or a building to live in and have a job available to them and have their children have education, that in fact wanted to cooperate with the British. As it turns out, and this is what they found when Sir Richard Catling and his group went out and seized documents from the Jewish agency, Haganah, the military wing, Irgun and Stern gangs, all of which were a military force. And when they seized these documents, they found evidence that there was a clandestine government. And what that means is that those same people that were operating and working with the British on immigration knew what the British people, or the government, was intending to do, how many they would allow in. They had no intentions of not allowing everyone in if they could get them. So there was an odds going on here as the numbers increased. In 1939, the British promulgated a white paper, and that white paper put a limit on the number of immigrants allowed in, and immediately the Zionist group saw itself at war with the Mandate people. McMichael, the High Commissioner, in 1941, writes, and it's quoted here, to the British government, the Secretary of State, "We are faced with a military force here that is superior not just to the Arabs, but to any attempt to control it. And not only that, but we have a political situation where the sympathy for the Jewish cause back home is incredibly great, and therefore anything we try to do to corral the policies we should be implementing is not going to work." Now, what kind of numbers? Back in 41, 42, they were looking at 20 to 80,000. And within 45, 46, we're looking upwards of 200,000. These are trained, experienced military. None of that, of course, is explained openly to the Mandate forces. Now, all through this evidence, the violence that was being used against the British is what we call terrorists, and that's what they called, what the British called the Jews there, the Zionists. They were terrorists. They blew up bridges. They bombed the King David Hotel, 91 people killed. It was a false flag operation. They went into the basement with canisters of apparently milk filled with bomb materials and blew it up. They kidnapped 2 British soldiers, hung them, booby-trapped their bodies, so when they were taken down, those taking their bodies down were blown up as well. This was violence of a kind that the British Mandate Authority didn't have the personnel at this point in time to deal with, or the backing of what Catling calls the three-legged stool. You need the government behind you, you need your military, and you need the people. And he was missing the government back home. And so they were faced with a dilemma, and they could not carry out the mandate. And so they had to hand it over to the UN.
There's a huge influx of Jewish refugees trying to come to Palestine. And in this sort of horrendous way, this is kind of a Zionist dream, in the sense that there are now many more Jewish people who want to come to Palestine. And the only way to create a Jewish state in Palestine is if Jewish people actually come to Palestine. The main problem that the Zionist movement had, and they discover this when they start to come here and see that there's actually people and there's a society and there's an economy and there's a culture, is that to create a Jewish state you need a Jewish majority, but the majority is Palestinian, is the indigenous people who are not Jewish. So beginning in the 20s and more earnest in 30s and the 40s, the leaders of the movement begin to think in earnest, logistically, how do we go about creating a Jewish state? Before this, again, the Palestinians were invisible. Palestinians would voluntarily just leave because they were asked to. As it progressed, there were more ideas of how to sort of pay people to leave, entice them, create job opportunities outside of the country. sort of different proposals on how to get Palestinians to voluntarily leave. But also from very early on, in the 20s, but definitely in the 30s, Zionist leaders begin to write down their thoughts in letters to one another, to other family members, etc., that the way to create the Jewish state would have to be by getting rid of this Palestinian majority, so that those remaining would be the Jewish majority. Now, there aren't very many ways to do this. One way would be to kill off as many Palestinians as possible, which would be genocide. Another way would be what was done in South Africa, where you had an indigenous majority, and what the colonizing minority did was said, okay, you can stay, but you don't exist politically. No vote, no presence in parliament, which means that you don't actually exist politically. You only exist as far as your exploitable labor exists. And option 3 is kick out the largest number of the indigenous community, which is what the Zionist leaders had begun contemplating. They used different words for it: transfer, population exchange, etc. But the idea is to entice, force as many Palestinians as possible to leave. And beginning in the 30s, the sort of military wing of the Zionist movement begins to put together the actual logistical military plan for how to do this. And this plan is revised 3 times. And the 4th version is Plan D, or in Hebrew, Plan Dalet. And really what the movement is waiting for is the opportunity to begin the implementation of what's been called the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, or the forcing the largest number of Palestinians to leave the country. The opportunity comes when Britain, after World War II, overextended, unable to maintain the areas of its vast empire that it couldn't continue to hold on to cheaply, specifically India and Palestine, hands over responsibility of these 2 places to the United Nations, the newly formed United Nations, and says, it's your problem now.
What is the latest information you have about the Intifada that's going on?
Well, I think what's going on right now with the Intifada entering its 23rd month, it's the oppression is getting worse and worse. There is an escalation of Israeli violence against the Palestinians. The problem is it's not getting reported as it used to be. I think, I don't know, maybe we can discuss this later on. But one of the starkest examples that I could remember is the question of the town of Beit Sahur, which is a small town near Bethlehem, where the inhabitants, the citizens, refused to pay taxes to the Israeli occupation authorities. They said, this is an occupation, we're not going to subsidize it. We're refusing to pay taxes. And the Israelis have been trying different methods here and there in order to bring the inhabitants into submission. Eventually, they raided the town like a couple of weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, and they confiscated the appliances, TVs, radios, irons, whatever the houses, refrigerators, washing machines, everything they had. They confiscated the beds, they confiscated the furniture. A pregnant woman, asked them if they could leave the bed so she could sleep on because she's pregnant. They said, well, you let us know when you're about to give the baby. We'll get you the bed back and then we'll take it from you. So they don't have anything, in the house. A man's TV was confiscated. It turns out it's not color. The Israeli bring it back and then they take his brother's TV, and between $1 and $2 million worth of appliances. And they're going to be auctioned, I think, this weekend in Tel Aviv to be sold. And this is, something that the Israelis have been trying to do, whether by, beating people up, which we've heard about a lot and we saw on TV a lot, or killing, shooting with live ammunition, plastic, rubber bullets, shooting tear gas, poisonous tear gas, that's manufactured right here in the United States, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Federal Labs.
Which has resulted in the deaths of a lot of people because
not only in the death, but also in the miscarriages. of hundreds of women because it is poisonous. It's not supposed to be thrown into closed areas. It has led to many people choking. It has led to many women, having miscarriages, which reminds me of something very interesting that the Bush administration claims that it is against abortion, against women's right to choose, because they want to save the fetus. In the meantime, they are supplying Israel with tear gas that kills Palestinian fetuses. So it kind of poses a question: what is this? Where does the rights start and where do they end? Is this really about rights of fetus or rights of protecting life, or is it about some hypocrisy? Wherever your interests fall, you'll go along with it. I think sometimes people wonder, why should Americans living thousands of miles away from the Middle East be concerned with a question like this? Don't they have enough problems of their own? And I agree. I think there are a lot of problems in this country. I think problems stemming from the fact that there is no funding for poor people to go to hospitals and get medical care. There isn't enough money going around for student loans to get an education to enable them to have a better life. There isn't enough money to provide jobs or provide housing. I come from New York. Every day when I go home and I come back, I see hundreds of homeless people. And it breaks your heart to see this situation in supposedly one of the richest countries in the world. Meanwhile, the United States spends vast amounts of money on the military budget. The highest recipient of all foreign aid is Israel, with $3.6 billion a year, mostly in grants. And this money is going to a state that is not only militarizing itself, becoming a garrison state, is not only, busting the sanctions in South Africa that supposedly the United States is trying to put economic boycott around apartheid to end, is not only training the drug cartels in Medellin in Colombia, or the death squads in El Salvador, or Pinochet regime in Chile, and so on. So that's one thing. But it's also violating U.S. standards of human rights in the occupied territories, killing Palestinians, and the U.S. State Department report itself said that Israel violates human rights, Palestinian human rights. So Israel is violating all these U.S. laws. The end user certificate, whereby every country that gets military aid has to certify where does it get spent. So it's not supposed to go to South Africa or to Colombia, anywhere else in the world. And the human rights. And we say that it is extremely important for both the Palestinian people and for the American people to stop this amount of funding that is going to subsidize the Israeli occupation, which is illegal by U.S. government standards. We're not even talking about Palestinian standards. And even if you talk about the homeless problem, we have 3 million Palestinian homeless refugees, 3 million refugees. If you stop this aid, you will resolve both the Palestinian political homelessness and the American homelessness problem. So we're very much in the same, corner, and there is a need to bring the Intifada home to the American people and have the American people working alongside the Palestinians in order to stop this flow that is not helping anybody, but it's bringing disaster all over.
Now, the issue then is, well, when Israel declared its independence, it was on May 14. Fascinating thing that on that week, before May 14, advertisements appeared in New York papers and elsewhere in the U.S. trying to convince the American people of the necessity of their president for all humanity and for peace in the Mideast to recognize the state of Israel, which will be declared on May 14. That day, Truman got a letter from the agency and a backup support from Nations Association telling him how significant this action had to be, but it went further. It said, what you would be recognizing is a state that has accepted the United Nations partition so that we have our homeland and we will abide by the law and bring peace to the area and at the same time care for the people that are there already. A month and 5 days before that May 14th deadline, they attacked the town of Deir Yassin. And that town became the first of about 20 different massacres that are corroborated and identified by both Elam Pappy and Benny Morris in their histories of this period, based on the sunlight availability of heretofore secret documents coming out of the Jewish agency in Haggadah, and saying in effect that this was necessary because you had to get rid of the Arab people in order to maintain a Jewish state. Benny Morris simply said they should have gotten rid of all of them during that period, and then it wouldn't be an issue. But they left about 20% of the people in what Israel became. And Israel was attacking not only Deir Yassin, but a number of others were actually depopulated before the British left the Mandate area and before they declared the independence. So there's a hiding of the reality of what they call peace from the president and from the American people. That kind of deception is at the root of how the Zionist group worked in this period in Mandate Palestine. It seems to me that that is genocidal. If you look at the definition, which they became a signature to, that is, once Israel was accepted by the United States, it signed into being a member of the UN and therefore should have abided by its understanding of what genocide is all about.
And what the United Nations does is it forms a committee and sends them over to discuss or to find out, to propose what the United Nations can do. And this committee comes to Palestine. The Palestinians and the Arabs boycott the committee because there's an understanding that it's looking into how to create a Jewish state on a land that Palestinians and Arabs had been living on for centuries and didn't see how it was that they were legitimately going to create a Jewish state. So there was a boycott, and so the people that the committee only spoke to were from the Zionist movement for the most part. Ultimately, what the slight majority in the committee recommends is partition. The minority says that no, it should remain one state for both people. The minority decision is that there should be two states. It hands over about 56% of the land to the Zionist movement, and says this will be the Jewish majority state. Jerusalem and Bethlehem get transformed into this special corpus separatum, an internationally operated zone. And then the 43% of the land, the remaining part, is to be the Arab majority state. Now, it's very important. Now, this is called the UN Partition Resolution or UN General Assembly Resolution 181. It's very important to note that even though, all the Palestinians and Arabs opposed it, and there's a lot of questions about the legitimacy of this resolution to begin with, the resolution itself does not call for population exchange. In the case of India, it does specifically say that there should be population exchange, and there was the horrendous results that we saw with the deaths of thousands of Hindus and Muslims in the process of population exchange. In the case of Palestine, the resolution is actually quite clear that Palestinians and Jews have the option of where they want to live. They can choose to stay in the piece of land that they are in, and they can choose to move to the other one. And they have the right fully to citizenship, and if they're going to be giving up property, they have the right to compensation for that property. Even this fundamental aspect of what's called the partition plan, or Resolution 181, ends up being violated by the Zionist movement. Now, when the UN issues this on November 29th, 1947, this resolution, this is essentially the spark of the 1948 war. Basically, the Zionist movement has now received international legitimacy to create its own state. We should note that by this time, by 1947, the Zionist movement, with all of the refugees coming from Europe and with all of the work of the Jewish Colonization Agency until then, had only basically accumulated about 600,000 Jewish migrants into Palestine. while there were about 1.2 to 1.3 million non-Jewish Palestinians. So 1/3 of the population, far stretched from being a majority. Also, in terms of land, the work of the Jewish National Fund, and a lot of it has a big question mark on it in terms of sort of buying property from absentee landlords who had acquired the land in pretty tricky ways, recruiting Palestinian collaborators to buy land because Palestinians, once they realized what was up, stopped selling land to the Jewish National Fund, but had only acquired about 6.7% of the land, a very tiny part of, I mean, not tiny, but a very small part of the land. So here again, the problem was stated very clearly. In 1947, we're only 1/3 of the population. We're only 6.7%. We only control 6.7% of the land. To create this Jewish state that we're dreaming of, we need this 600,000 to become the majority, and we need to take control of most of the land. And so the plan is put in place. Plan Dalit, which we talked about, the military, the logistics of how to create this Jewish state begins. And the plan essentially calls for connecting existing Jewish settlements to one another, so clearing out Palestinian towns and villages between them, as well as clearing out Palestinian villages from borders with the neighboring Arab states in case of Arab attack. And this is what takes place. The plan officially begins its implementation in March of 1948. Between March and May of that year, about half of the Palestinian refugees are expelled. About 300,000 Palestinians become refugees. On May 14th, Israel is declared an independent state. After this, Arab armies invade. Of course, there's also sort of, the way that the official story is that, these massive armies come and this little state of Israel defends itself and wins. And in the course of the war, people leave and become refugees. So that's the official story of why there are Palestinian refugees and why Palestinian refugees are the Arab state's fault for invading in the first place. So of course, we should remember that half of these refugees were expelled before any Arab state invaded, quote unquote. But also that most of these Arab states were either newly independent or still under some form of mandate system, as was the case with Syria and Lebanon. The Egyptian army sent in basically soldiers with very little training and very old weapons, many of which were dysfunctional, and they didn't have much success militarily, to the point that one of the battalions that almost stayed intact went back to Egypt with the express intent of getting rid of the monarchy in Egypt, and within 4 years had done so. And Jamal Abdel Nasser, who became the president of Egypt after the removal of the monarchy, fought in Palestine, Fallujah. The only really trained and armed Arab army was the Jordanian army, which also had control over the Iraqi army since they were coming through Jordan. And the Zionist leadership had already sort of made a deal with the Jordanians, that the Jordanians would get the West Bank and Israel could do what it pleased with the rest of the country. And Palestinian refugees, many of them knew this long before because they saw the behavior of the army, the Jordanian army, when it came in. But the research has been done pretty conclusively in the Israeli archives on this deal by an Israeli professor named Avi Shleim in a book called Collusion Across the Jordan. So it wasn't really a miraculous victory. It was a much better armed and trained army, much of which was trained in the fight against the Nazis in Europe. So trained by official European armies and by the British here in Palestine.
I would say that the reactions are in two extremes. There's either a lot of hostility to what we are doing, and I recently had a rather good dose of experience on that score, both from Jews and from non-Jews, to bringing, let's say, the message of Israeli brutality and atrocities of the West Bank and Gaza Strip occupation to the American public, namely that some are so hostile to any idea that Israel can do any harm, because you see, Israel is the emotional appeal has reached the proportions of cult worship. The American Jews have been, I think, worshiping two cults. One is the cult of Israel, and Israel worship is a very important element of Jewish community life. If you were to take Israel away from the life of Jewish communities, what would they have? If you were to look at bulletin boards of synagogues and other institutional places where Jews get together, the focus is on things related to Israel, either in the American government or in the American context, or in relation to Israel. And the other one is that there is a cult of the Holocaust.
Yes.
Holocaust is being worshipped as a political instrument because if you truly feel terrible about the Holocaust, then you could not countenance the Holocaust that is being perpetrated on the Palestinian people.
It's incredible. You see the quotes that they use the same terminology and phrases that the Nazis used, like the final, they're going to have the final solution.
Right.
In Lebanon.
And the thing that, I mean, since you mentioned that, I can tell you, I was showing it to Barbara yesterday. There are some detachments in the Israeli army, I don't know whether it's a platoon or whatever the size is, that have called themselves the Mengele detachment.
Oh, my God.
And the Auschwitz detachment. And what they have done is, in order to show that they're particularly tough in relation to putting down this Palestinian insurrection. Now, this is not published in the American press. And whenever I say it to an American, their reaction is what yours is. I can't believe it.
Well,
it's so.
I read the Palestinian press, or at least and some of the left-wing newspapers. It still is a shock, even when I read it.
That's right.
But this is a curious aspect of control of the American press, and that is that there is a lot of criticism by Israeli citizens in the Israeli press that never gets into the American press.
Well, that's one of the curious things, is in fact that the Israeli press is much freer than the American press. And I think it's really a very simple explanation, if I may just spend 30 seconds to tell you about it. The Israeli public is not shocked by the revelations of the press. The American public would be shocked by that. Very simple.
I mean, so most of the way that the villages, Palestinian villages and towns were dealt with in 1948 was that the army would come in and surround them for 2 or 3 sides, leaving one side open, facing sort of towards the closest border. So the idea wasn't to kill off as many Palestinians as possible. It was to force them to leave, specifically to cross a border and become refugees. Usually, and there's a general pattern for how this took place, the army would come in and use artillery bombardment to force as many people to leave before the ground troops would go in. Later in 1948, the Israeli military acquired an air force, and the villages that were attacked after this experienced aerial bombardment as well. After this, the village would be occupied physically by ground troops. Those who remained would be rounded up in a central area. The men would be separated from the women and children. The women and children would be forced to flee, often with guns blaring behind them. The men would, the Jewish National Fund had kept files on each Palestinian town and village, which had, the name of the village, the types of crops grown, the size of its land, but also the names of Palestinian collaborators who'd worked with the Jewish National Fund, as well as Palestinians who'd been involved with the resistance. And so they would often use these collaborators to kind of pick out those who were involved in the resistance. They would be executed, and then those men who remained would either be put into prison camps, into labor camps, or forced to leave as well. So this is the general pattern, but every village has its own unique story as well. So some villages hold out for 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, facing a series of assaults, military assaults. Other villages, the military bombardment was enough to make them so afraid for their lives that they left. The use of massacres by the Zionist forces was also very effective. I mean, they committed these massacres, but also ensured that news of these massacres would travel. So one of the most famous of these is the Deir Yassin massacre in April of 1948. And I mean, the cases of rape and looting and murder, and then parading the bodies in the streets of Jerusalem, made it so that news of this massacre traveled very, very quickly and frightened people to the point where they were much more likely to leave their village. It's near Jerusalem, Deir Yassin, which is also near Bethlehem. So many of the refugees here in this area who are from the villages and towns close to Bethlehem and Jerusalem are ones where it's very common in sort of Nakba survivor stories to hear that Deir Yassin was one of the main reasons that they left. News of Deir Yassin made them, as soon as they heard that the Zionist forces were coming, they left, for fear that what happened at Deir Yassin would happen to them. Small military units would also come after the village or town was occupied and the army had moved on. A small military unit would come in responsible for looting anything valuable in the homes and then just blowing up the houses. And the idea was that by blowing up these villages and eliminating their physical presence, refugees would be less likely to return since their homes were no longer there. And it would make the landscape, it would sort of de-Palestinianize the landscape. Basically, it would no longer look like there was a village there. So you're erasing the memory of Palestinian presence on the land. By the end of the Nakba, around 13,000 Palestinians had been killed. Over 530 towns and villages had been depopulated and destroyed. And over 750,000 Palestinians had become refugees. Some Palestinians who were displaced from their towns and villages didn't cross a border and sort of remained in the state but living somewhere else. These are what we would call internally displaced people. Today there's about 300,000 Palestinian citizens of the State of Israel who continue to be internally displaced. They live in the state, they have citizenship in the state, but their lands in the village have been confiscated, and they're not allowed to go back to their village and live there. Many of these villages, again, have been transformed into Jewish National Fund parks and forests. In other cases, it's land that's now part of an Israeli kibbutz or moshav or city or town. In the cities, Palestinians who were able to remain in the cities, and this is a very tiny minority, were most often concentrated into one neighborhood in the city. So in Jerusalem, it was Baqa neighborhood. In Yafa, it was Ajami neighborhood. And these cities were sealed off physically. And between 1948 and 1966, Israel governed Palestinians with a separate set of laws than it governed its Jewish citizens. The citizens, Palestinians who remained and became citizens, were governed under what we call military laws, which are an extension of the emergency laws that the British had put in place. One of the defining aspects of these laws was that it controlled mobility into and out of Palestinian villages and those neighborhoods that Palestinians were confined to during these years, from 48 to 66. So it was you needed written permission from the military commander of your sort of reservation or of your area to be able to leave or come back in.
I would say that Israeli society is not reorganizing itself in any positive sense of the word. I'm unfortunately very pessimistic about that. I would say that in general, Israeli society has moved increasingly to the right, towards a form of fascism. The small groups of people who have been active in extending assistance to people in the West Bank have been very severely harassed in one way or the other. I would say that probably the most severe harassment has been extended to the people of military age, the men of military age, who have refused service in the occupied territories. I'm sure you're familiar with them. There are hundreds of them. They're called the gray refusers simply because they're not made public and many of them are not thrown in jail. What happens is that through personal arrangements between the individual and his commanding officer, they're not being sent to the territories. They've made an example of about a dozen people who are repeatedly put in jail for periods of 25 to 30 days. And then when they come out, they get an order to go to the territories. The order is turned down, and they sit another 35 or 25 days. So there's some now that have been in jail for several months.
Yes, this was a woman named Maha Nassar. She's 34 years old. She has 2 children. During the first months of the Intifada, she was tear gassed. She had a miscarriage as a result of that. Then she was arrested, by the Israeli authorities. At the same time, her husband was serving a 6-month administrative detention period in Ansar 3 detention camp in the Negev desert. Her 2 children were left.
Place.
It's a very, very horrible. It's a concentration camp, to say the least. And her children were left with nobody to take care of them. Maha then was released, and on October 4th, which is not a long time ago, she was arrested again, and people think it's because of her efforts on behalf of the Beit Sahur people who are resisting the tax war. And she was put in the Mascobia detention center, which is known to be an interrogation and torture center. That's where they put the prisoners. And due to the efforts of a large group of people, both in the United States, in Europe, and throughout the world, due to the fact that in Boston, where Edna is, a group called Maha Nassar Support Committee was set up from different movement groups, and hundreds of mailgrams were sent to Rabin, the Israeli defense minister, could say the war minister. And Maha Nassar was released. Not only she was released, but even 2 days before she was, you have 14 days in prison before you see the Red Cross, 18 days before you see your lawyer. On her 11th or 12th day, she saw her lawyer because of this, campaign. And she was already aware of the fact that we are waging a campaign on her behalf. Now Maha is, free. She had lost a lot of weight because she went on a hunger strike all the period that she was in jail. She needed a checkup and so on. We still have the case of Dr. Riyad Malki, a very close friend of mine. He graduated from New York, from the Polytechnic Institute in New York, with a PhD in civil engineering. And he is a lecturer at Birzeit University. He was also arrested the day before Maha was arrested, because on his way to meet with foreign consulates in Jerusalem and to participate in a press conference on the situation of Beit Sahur. And Dr. Malki is still incarcerated. He hasn't been released. His lawyer has been able to see him, but he's still at Mascobia prison camp. He is on a talking strike. He doesn't talk to the Israelis. And until now, they haven't released him, even though we had many, many people intervene on his behalf. Amnesty International is seriously considering adopting him as a political prisoner of conscience. There are many efforts on his behalf. But the situation, but we had a success with Maha Nassar. We believe that we can have success with Dr. Malki if more and more people intervene by, mail-grabbing to the defense minister of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin.
We must also remember that these are people that are known internationally and that have a support group internationally. But I'm thinking of the hundreds and thousands of men whom nobody knows except their families, and the dozens of women whom nobody knows except their families, who haven't seen their children except through a barbed wire at a great distance, because the Israelis on visiting day do not allow mothers and children to touch each other. Talking about Nazification.
The formation of the Jewish state done through deceit. That is to say, it went to the UN, it went to the United States, it went to the American people, and it proclaimed one thing while it was, in fact, eradicating, wiping off the map, bulldozing down to nothing, almost 418 towns and villages, leaving a couple of them still standing, which are now inhabited, obviously, by Jewish people. That, to me, is breaking international law. Yet, once it was recognized by the United States, for some reason, it automatically becomes legitimate. Well, let's assume it was legitimate. So now we come forward and you look at the conditions that prevail at the present time, and we have just witnessed, and here's proof of it right there in that book, in 32 chapters, that they have committed crimes against humanity. The governments of Israel in conjunction with the governments of the United States. What is the issue now when you look at this and realize that if you go to the maps through confiscation and through forced purchase and through politics and legal status, all of the land, essentially, with the exception of what amounts to 12%, is now in the hands of the Israeli government. Now that alone seems to suggest a real problem relative to wiping the people off the map, if you like. Now, can you bolster that with other issues? And if you were today to go to the government of Israel and the Likud government, it has as policy that there will not be a Palestinian state west of Jordan. That's policy. That's wiping it off before it even gets negotiated. That, it seems to me, is much more stringent and an active removal of the land that the people live on and had lived on for over 1,800 years. But that's not alone what we're talking about. We're also looking at, did they have any intent whatsoever of negotiating and having a peace plan to bring forward? Reality is, and one of the chapters in the book is that of Jeff Halper, and for 55 pages he itemizes step by step and fact by fact the problem with Israel. And the problem is they do not intend, and they have not intended, to come to a two-state solution. This is not in their plan. Now, this situation has gotten worse over time, including to today. Now, genocide is defined here. The only way you can arrive at genocide other than to see the definition, look at the facts that are present on the ground and everywhere else, and realize if this were brought to an international court, if it were brought through the United Nations Human Rights Council for judgment, would genocide apply? Let's take the Goldstone report. After the Operation Cast Lead, where Israel invaded Gaza. And in doing so, a Goldstone report comes out which states crimes against humanity. What it was asking for is that this be brought before the Human Rights Council and the international courts. The United States vetoes it, as it has vetoed 80 other prior Security Council resolutions related to asking that actions done by Israel are in fact brought before the court system, so that if there's validity in this definition of genocide, we can see it. It can be acted upon. The United States has prevented that. It does not allow Israel to be brought up for any criticism whatsoever, even though 170 or more nations at a time will vote that resolution into place. In other words, we become the means by which no action and immunity for Israel is maintained. That, it seems to me, it becomes an issue if you want to find out why genocide is in this book. This book is determined to show what genocide means and to show you with more than 20 worldwide authors how that definition applies to the occupation of Palestine, whether it's Chris Hedges or it's a Uri Avnery or it's a Francis Boyle. All these writers who are looking at actions taking place are looking at it and seeing their genocide. Now, some would say, well, you can't use that word because it hasn't been proven. Well, it hasn't been proven because Israel controls the voice in America, in its Congress and its Senate, almost unanimously. Just plain human sense would suggest to you that maybe there are differences of opinion on certain matters, but not when it comes to Israel. And therefore, we are complicit. That's one of the acts of genocide, to be complicit in this. U.S. is complicit in this. All right? Now, if you want to condemn the book or condemn the editor of the book or condemn all the writers in the book who have dealt with this concept of genocide, then I would urge that we bring genocide before the courts and say, is it or is it not? And then judge the book.
כל בן תרבות בעולם יודע שהארץ הזאת היא שלנו, של עם ישראל ושלנו בלבד. כל בן תרבות בעולם יודע שגלינו ממנה וידענו בכל הגלויות לאורך כל השנים, וידעו גם אויבינו ושונאינו שנשוב אליה, כי היא שלנו, רק שלנו, ואנחנו שלה, רק שלה. ומהסיבה הזו לא תהיה לעולם מדינה פלסטינית בארץ ישראל, כי גם אין עם פלסטיני, אין עם כזה. ומהסיבה הזו הרוב הגדול בעם ישראל מתנגד להקמת מדינה פלסטינית, שלא רק שהיא לא צודקת וחסרת כל עוגן היסטורי, אלא היא גם סכנה קיומית למדינת ישראל.
צריך לעודד הגירה מרצון באלף דרכים. יש 1000 דרכים. הדרך הראשונה היא כל הפסל תקין שאתם רואים. כל בית שנהרס ברצועה מעודד בדרכו הגירה.
יש לי היום פסל תקין אחד לפנתיאון.
כל פסל תקין מעודד בדרכו הגירה מרצון. וכמה שיותר שטח חרב והרוס יעודד יותר הגירה מרצון. אבל יש עוד 1000 דרכים לעודד הגירה מרצון.
טוב, אדון גייס 50, מר כסיף, לא אתה ולא השותפים שלך שמגנים עליך מבית ומבחוץ מזיזים לנו כהוא זה. הממשלה הזו לא מגמגמת לגביך. אתה יכול להמשיך לחלום שנסיים את הלחימה ללא ניצחון. אנחנו לא מתביישים לומר שאנחנו רוצים לראות את חיילי צה"ל הגיבורים והקדושים שלנו תופסים את סינואר והמחבלים שלו באוזניים וגוררים אותם בכל הרצועה בדרך למרתפי שב"ס, אבל שב"ס של בן גביר, לא של ברלב או מיכאלי, או במקרה הכי טוב לארון קבורה כזה או אחר. אני אישית גאה בהריסות של עזה, ושכל תינוק, גם עוד 80 שנה מהיום, יספר לנכדיו מה עשו היהודים שרצחו להם משפחות, אנסו אותם וחטפו להם אזרחים. אתה והחברים שלך יכולים לחלום שנאפשר לכם לבנות ממשלה, כי אם אתם חושבים שהפרס על שחיטת יהודים, אונס נשים, עריפת ראשים וחטיפת אזרחים יהיה לקבל לשבת בממשלת שינוי, אתה חולם. תצעקו עד מחר שלום עכשיו ובחירות עכשיו, מקפלן ועד עזה שישמעו אתכם. לנו יש משימה, אני מסיימת, והדבר האחרון שניתן לכם הוא שעופר כסיף יעלה להר הבית עם דגל פלסטין, וסינואר יהיה שר הביטחון של המדינה הפלסטינית כמו אחיו ערפאת. לא יונה ולא עלה של זית, רק חרב לערוף לסינואר את הראש, זה מה שהוא יקבל.
I can feel the blood creeping up from the heathens. Got will, got fight, got pride, got reason. If they wanna go eat, then you know I'm gonna feed them. If you're coming for me, hope you're ready for a demon. I got eyes in the back of my head, I'm seeing. Take me for granted and you know I'm leaving. I'ma take what's mine with the webs I'm weaving. I could take this crowd from seeing to believing. Got a taste for blood and my tongue keeps bleeding. From the words I spit, so sharp, so freezing. So cold, behold, frostbite they feeling. I could tear you apart or I could go heal them. Don't believe in fate, don't believe in ceilings. I just need a taste and my mind starts peeling. I don't pace myself, I grind on kneeling. Got lust for change, I just love the feeling. I ain't gonna give up. Got too little time, I'ma live up. Head down, push forward through the tough times. Cause anything worth doing is a tough climb. And I ain't gonna give up. Got too little time, I'ma live up. Head down, push forward through the tough times. Cause anything worth doing is a tough climb. Cause I'ma live life for the fight, yeah, I'm here to get it. I got drive, got sight, always have a vision. I go by at night, I be in my feelings. I'ma be fine, need time and I'll soon be winning. I live life for the fight, yeah, I'm here to get it. I got drive, got sight, always have a vision. I go by at night, I be in my feelings. I'ma be fine, need time and I'll soon be winning. I can feel the blood creeping up from the heathens. Got will, got fight, got pride, got reason. If they wanna go eat, then you know I'm gonna feed them. If you're coming for me, hope you're ready for a demon. I can feel the blood creeping up from the heathens. Got will, got fight.
I'm ready for a demon.
Bah.